Welcome everyone to the Saturday night reading stream. Tonight, I'll be continuing to read Ilan Pappe's A Very Short History of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. I've decided to keep this diagonal camera setup. I think it'll work a bit better. First, though, I want to take a look at something regarding these hate speech laws. Let's have a look at this. So I know we were discussing this in that stream yesterday, and I have considered that maybe these streams should be a little bit longer and probably encompass a bit more than just gaming and reading and whatnot. So let's take a look at this. Okay. Let's have a look, shall we? Just got these in my watch later. Just thought I'd have a look at a couple of them. So this is 7 News first.
Anthony Albanese has performed a stunning backflip changing controversial hate speech legislation amid fears the new laws would stall. The Prime Minister will now split the mega bill. He says the move ensures major gun reforms will pass Parliament.
On the eve of historic hate speech reforms, Anthony Albanese changes his mind.
It is time that the politics stopped.
Presenting a new plan he hopes will pass the Parliament, Labor needing the support of either the Coalition or the Greens in the Senate.
We will not be proceeding with the racial vilification provisions.
Removing the clause that made it an offence to publicly promote or incite racial hatred following the Bondi terror attack. Offenders would have faced 5 years jail for graffiti, communication through social media, displaying flags and distributing material that caused a person or group to fear for their safety.
We will only proceed with measures that have the support of the Parliament.
Anglican Archbishop Michael Stead telling 7 News that part of the legislation was a problem.
Faith leaders are very concerned that the bill criminalises speech that should not be criminal. When you criminalise hate speech at that kind of level, you end up with all kinds of people being brought before the courts who ought not to be there.
The Greens worried about the impact on freedom of speech.
Can be used to shut down political discourse and the right to protest.
Didn't the Greens fucking say that they would support the bill if it included LGBTQ protections? I swear I heard that they said that. Did they say that? Because what a fucking backflip if that's the case. What a fucking backflip if that is the case. Yeah, right, okay. Well, good you opposed it, I guess. No matter what the fucking reason was.
Prime Minister's changes ensure Labor's historic gun reforms will pass the Senate with help from the Greens.
The Greens are more than willing to work with the government to pass gun law reforms.
From the federal opposition leader tonight, his colleagues were right to label this a show.
Senior members of the coalition all called for hate speech to be outlawed.
Susan Lee asking more than 20 times for Parliament to be recalled, only to then say the Prime Minister was moving too fast.
The coalition were calling for this to all be finished before Christmas.
Anthony Albanese is confident these changes will be enough to get the help needed from either the Coalition or the Greens. But tonight, the Greens tell me this changes nothing. They won't be voting for the hate speech component of this legislation. From the opposition leader's office, Susan Lee says she needs more time to sit with the legislation. Neither party convinced by the changes, leaving Anthony Albanese with a big fight on his hands. Hugh.
Isabel Mullen in Canberra, thank you.
Seemingly out of options.
We got an ABC version of what appears to be the same. The gun reforms are no good either. The gun reforms are no good either. The fact the Greens are supporting it. What I said yesterday. Controlled opposition. We need more guns, not less. And, you know, some people are going to say, oh, you might... Faggot. If the people want to be able to defend themselves from tyranny, we need a right to bear arms. We need a Second Amendment. That's my belief. We need a Second Amendment. There's probably not much point in going any further. I think that's probably all that was really important here. So, I mean, I think it's probably more than enough for me. Haven't really got any views on here, do I? Not on Twitter yet, by the looks. Let's just have a look. Before I get started on here, I'll turn this off. Blow this back up. No views on Twitter yet. What about on YouTube? No, nobody tonight. Oh well. Let's begin reading. So, last week I left off at the chapter, why did the Zionist movement begin ethnic cleansing? And this is sort of after sort of quiet years. So we have the events of 1929. What happened in 1929 is known to the Palestinians as the Al-Barak Revolution. In Islam, Al-Barak is a winged half-mule, half-donkey who carried Muhammad from Mecca to Jerusalem and from Jerusalem to heaven. Prophet Muhammad, in tradition, tied Al-Barak to a crack in the western wall, enclosing the site of the Second Temple in Jewish tradition. Zionists, of course, call it a riot. As in 1920, when Zionists marched through the Muslim Quarter, the disturbance started in the old city of Jerusalem. Since autumn 1928, Zionists had been increasingly vocally challenging Muslim control over access to the Holy Mount, or Haram al-Sharif. On 15th of August 1929, The Haganah and revisionist Zionists inspired by Jabotinsky staged demonstrations by the wall, leading Muslims to mobilize for counter-protests the next day. Amid rumors and deliberate incitement, violent incidents between Muslims and Jews occurred throughout the week, culminating in 17 Jews being killed after Muslims' Friday prayers on 23rd of August. This set off a chain reaction, and within 1 week, 133 Jews and 116 Palestinians lost their lives in the ensuing chaos. Violence did not stay confined to Jerusalem. It spread to other cities, most notoriously the Hebron massacre. The Jews of Hebron were part of the small Jewish minority that existed in Palestine many centuries before the arrival of Zionism. They lived peacefully with the Muslim community. Both communities believe in the sanctity of Hebron, as it is the resting place of the prophet Abraham, revered in both religions. However, young Zionists, yeshiva students in modern European clothing, were unwelcome arrivals. As news from Jerusalem took hold, Muslims from villages just outside Hebron descended upon the town. 67 Jews were massacred, although some successfully found shelter in the homes of sympathetic Muslim families. Now, the Hebron massacre, a horrific atrocity, is weaponized by the official Israeli narrative to prove coexistence isn't possible, and, ironically, to justify the subsequent massacres of Palestinians. Although the immediate trigger for the events of 1929 was a religious one, the disturbances spread quickly and devastatingly as Palestinians witnessed the social order breaking down before their eyes. It was an outburst of frustration after a decade when the Zionist movement had moved in leaps and strides. In this decade, in the countryside, Palestinians could see what lay ahead for everyone: ethnic cleansing and purposeful immiseration. As more and more Palestinians were forced out of agricultural work, shanty towns emerged. In the shanty towns of Haifa in the north of Palestine, a new form of Palestinian resistance took shape against Zionism and its British accomplices: guerrilla warfare. Here, a charismatic preacher came onto the stage. The Imam is al-Din al-Qassam. You might recognize the name. The military wing of Hamas is named after him, as well as their early rockets. However, many secular Palestinian resistance groups also honor his legacy in introducing, in a doomed stand against the British, the methods of guerrilla warfare into the Palestinian struggle. Al-Qassam was born in Syria in 1882. In 1919-20, he joined the revolt against the French occupiers, fighting them in the mountains. The French recognized he posed a threat and sentenced him to death. In late 1920, fleeing the French, he settled in Haifa. He preached in the Istiklal Mosque, still standing today, and taught in a Muslim school. He quickly developed a name for himself. Al-Qassam, with his background in anti-colonial struggle, was able to enthuse young Muslims living in the shanty towns around Haifa to start their own paramilitary groups. They wanted to prepare for protracted struggle against British colonialism. However, faced with a large influx of Jewish immigration and increasing surveillance by British authorities, he was forced to show his hand prematurely. In the hills near Jenin, he and 11 others fought off a much larger British force for several hours in November 1935 until Al-Qassam and 4 others were dead. Haifa declared a general strike the very next day. You can still visit his tomb near a Jewish town called Nesher, what was then Belad al-Sheikh. His death inspired increasing numbers of young Palestinians to take up arms and to prepare to fight a war against Britain to force it to abandon its Zionist policies. He also established greater unity in the Palestinian political leadership, previously divided along family lines between the Husseinis and the Nashashibis. Although al-Qassam's military revolt was destined to fail, he paved the way for the more organized resistance that would follow in the latter half of the 1930s. Chapter 5. The Great Arab Revolt, 1936-9. After 1929, the British recognized that what they were trying to address was a conflict between two peoples, both of whom they had made commitments to. They sent 2 commissions of inquiry to investigate the causes of the outbreak of violence in 1929. One was headed by Sir Walter Shaw, and one by Sir John Hope Simpson. The Shaw Commission concluded that the violence was the result of the Zionist project of dispossessing the Palestinian farmers and Palestinians' fundamental rejection of Zionism. The Hope-Simpson inquiry, which was carried out afterwards, reached similar conclusion. The final report recommended limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine. Initially, the British government took the findings of these commissions very seriously and was prepared to change course. In October 1930, Lord Parsfield Sidney Webb presented a white paper that proposed restricting further land purchases and immigration on part of the Zionists, and was heavily critical of Zionist organizations for exacerbating mob unemployment. This was a dramatic change in government policy. But even in 1930, there was a very influential pro-Zionist lobby in Britain. Under pressure from Chaim Weizmann, then leader of the World Zionist Organization, the British Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, issued a letter as a clarification of the white paper in early 1931. In practice, it was a retraction. Pro-Zionist policies would continue on the ground in Palestine, unimpeded. So even this early, you had Zionist lobbies with a bit of power. The promise of a change that was swiftly withdrawn added fuel to the fire on the Palestinian side. They attempted to emulate the strategies of the Zionist lobby, but they were not anywhere near as well resourced. Between 1930 and 1936, Palestinians attempted to alter British policy through petitions, demonstrations, and conferences in London, all in vain. In 1936, the Palestinian leadership knew something more potent was needed. An umbrella grouping of all Palestinian political organizations, the Arab Higher Committee, called for a 6-month national strike in April 1936, demanding an end to Jewish immigration and land purchases and the establishment of a Palestinian national government. The younger and more rural elements of the Palestinian resistance did not stop at strike action. They staged an all-out revolt, targeting British and Jewish forces. It took 3 years for the uprising to be quashed. Britain used brute force to suppress the revolt, including aerial bombardment by the Royal Air Force. Moreover, it deployed models of collective punishment now familiar to us all from the scenes unfolding in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. Most shockingly, in June 1936, the British Army blew up over 200 buildings in Jaffa's old city, making over 6,000 Palestinians homeless. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, many arrested and wounded. The military leaders judged to be behind the revolt were ruthlessly targeted, with a huge number killed. Beyond the leaders, large sections of the military elite, the most experienced forces on the Palestinian side, lost their lives. The goal was not simply to quash the revolt. It was to ensure that the Palestinians could not ever revolt effectively again. And indeed, in 1948, the Palestinians were swiftly overcome by the advancing Zionist forces intent on founding Israel. Some months into the revolt, during a ceasefire, the British sent an inquiry commission, the Peel Commission, in search of a solution to the conflict. In July 1937, the commission recommended the partition of Palestine and offered more or less the creation of a small future Jewish state alongside Jordan, then known as Transjordan, which would annex what the report referred to as the Arab parts of Palestine. Places of particular religious and strategic importance would remain under provisional British rule through the Mandate system until treaties were agreed between Britain and the two new states. As for the remaining Palestinian population, in the land earmarked for the Jewish state, roughly 250,000 people, it proposed transferring them to Transjordan. It is not surprising that the Arab Higher Committee rejected this recommendation entirely. The Zionist movement on the ground was then under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion. He took a more conciliatory attitude to the British proposals. Even though others in the Zionist movement demanded that he reject the recommendations, Ben-Gurion was willing to take the relatively small area offered to the Zionists as a state for two reasons. As he explained, the Jews were still a small community. Accepting the recommendations now didn't rule out taking more territory in the future. And secondly, it cost him nothing to extend an olive branch to the British in this way, because he knew with absolute certainty that the Palestinians would reject the proposals. He was already thinking ahead. With his closest confidants and his son, he discussed the possibilities of Zionists preparing to transfer Palestinians from Jewish state territory. He intuited that the British would not aid in this. Realizing a solution on the ground was not forthcoming, Britain contemplated taking the Peel proposal to the League of Nations. Before it did that, it sent another inquiry commission to Palestine, the Woodhead Commission, in 1938. This commission rejected partition as recommended by the Peel Commission as completely impracticable, as any partition would require fast and forcible population transfer of the Palestinians. In the preferred solution of the Woodhead Commission, there would be a small Jewish state, a larger Palestinian state, and land in the north and south, as well as Jerusalem, would remain Mandate territory. These would all be joined in a customs union. This proposal was even controversial among the Commission members. In short, the Woodhead Commission made clear that it was not possible, without huge injustice, for the bulk of Mandatory Palestine to become a Jewish state. Following this realization, it was easier to bring the revolt to an end, as Palestinian leaders hoped Britain finally understood it was impossible to impose a Jewish state on the Palestinians. The British government published a white paper in May 1939 that more or less said as much. It declared that given there were now over 450,000 Jews settled in Palestine, Britain had fulfilled its obligation under the Balfour Declaration to provide a national home. It recommended that Palestine become an independent state in 10 years to be governed jointly by Palestinians and Jews. Jewish immigration and land purchases would be limited for at least the next 5 years. Predictably, this made no one happy. The Zionist leadership rejected the white paper as a complete contradiction of the commitments made in the Balfour Declaration. The Palestinian Arab Higher Committee was disappointed that the white paper still expressed affirmation of a Jewish national home and only proposed limited Jewish immigration for 5 years. Only a few months after the white paper, Hitler and Stalin invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Britain was conscious both of Hitler's attempts to win over newly independent states like Iraq and the need to place Allied troops in Palestine as a strategically critical staging post in the Middle East. And so, even as Jewish people across Nazi-occupied Europe sought refuge elsewhere, Britain kept the doors of Palestine firmly closed. Hitler's brisk sweep through Europe and the consequent mass murder of Jewish people hardened Zionist attitudes. They no longer wanted to compromise with Palestinians in any way. At the Biltmore Hotel in New York in May 1942, the Zionist leadership declared its intention to turn all of historical Palestine into a Jewish state. The New York location is significant. The Zionist movement understood that the keys to Palestine's future might not be in Britain's hands for much longer, now that a new world power was entering the spotlight. The Zionist movement was keen to be as strong in the US as it was previously in Britain. Palestinians had no equivalent to the Zionist lobby in Britain or the US in 1942. The Palestinian leadership had still not recovered from its utter decimation during the Arab Revolt. Most of its prominent politicians were exiled or in prison. The leading figure in Palestinian politics at that time was Haj Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who had initially been supported by the British in the early 1920s. By the 1930s, he had founded his own political organization, with members from his influential family, as well as other local elites. Another Palestinian grouping centered on another elite family, the Nashashibis. These and other groups were represented on the Arab Higher Committee, but Haj Amin remained the most high-profile figure and was chair of the committee. When the Arab Revolt broke out, the British administration declared that the committee was illegal and relieved Haj Amin of his position as president of the Supreme Muslim Council. In July 1937, the British authorities issued a warrant for his arrest. Tipped off in advance, he managed to escape initially to Damascus, but landed in Nazi Germany in 1941, making radio broadcasts to mobilize Arab Muslims against the British. At the time of the Second World War, he was not alone in acting according to the maxim, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." His flirtation with the Nazis was short and insignificant, making no difference one way or the other to the war effort. However, his association with the Nazis is still used to discredit the Palestinian liberation movement in the Israeli narrative. Sometimes it gets taken to absurd levels, such as when the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed that it was Haj Amin who gave Hitler the idea for death camps, and that otherwise Hitler would have just deported the Jews. With Haj Amin in exile, and the remainder of the Palestinian leadership mainly criminalized, the Zionist movement was free to agitate for a de-Arabized Palestine with Anglo-American blessing. The Palestinians simply did not have political clout comparable to that of the Zionists. Their only hope now was to rely on help from neighboring Arab countries, but they themselves were not yet established as proper nation-states. After the Holocaust, where over 6 million Jews perished across Europe, European powers, eager to wash their own consciences clean, had even less sympathy for the Palestinians. This was not out of any particular concern for Jews. At least 250,000 Jews languished in displaced persons camps in Central Europe long after the war had concluded. But the future of the Jewish people, in the eyes of Britain and the USA, had to be settled. Many survivors of the Holocaust no longer had any homes to go back to in Europe. Well, I am going to go and grab some water. How am I looking in terms of the number of people watching? Still none. Well, okay. Well, let's continue. I'll read 2 more chapters tonight and then we'll leave it. Audio on still. Turn that off. Chapter 6 On the Road to the Nakba, 1945 to 7. The British Mandate would end in 1948. In the 3 years between the end of the war and British departure, we can identify 3 concurrent processes resulting in the catastrophe for the Palestinian people known as the Nakba and the establishment of the State of Israel. The first was the failure of diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the conflict between Palestinians and Zionist settlers. The second was the inadequacy of the Arab world's attempts to make a meaningful impact on the situation on the ground. The third was the final preparation on the Zionist side for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. which would be translated into action as soon as the British left in 1948. The diplomatic effort, 1945 to 7. Shortly after the Second World War concluded, Britain still hoped to find a solution that both sides could live with. To that end, the British government enlisted the Americans, establishing a new Anglo-American Committee in November 1945, tasked with the last international effort to resolve the conflict before the end of the mandate. The committee arrived in Palestine in early 1946 and made its report in April of that year. The report succeeded as a socio-economic investigation, providing meticulously detailed information about the demography, economy, education, and politics of mandatory Palestine. Scholars use it as a resource to this day, but in terms of finding a real solution, the report offered nothing both sides hadn't heard dozens of times before. It did not recommend a Jewish state or an independent Palestinian state, but proposed an extended British presence in mandatory Palestine, overseeing autonomous Arab and Jewish enclaves. Both sides rejected this idea out of hand, realizing they would be denied the very democratic rights that the new international order was supposedly founded on. By the beginning of 1947, Britain had had enough of Palestine. It was at last starting to dawn on the British that they could not obtain Palestinian consent for the promise they made to the Jewish people in the Balfour Declaration, i.e., for a Jewish national home. And moreover, what the Zionist movement now meant by a Jewish national home was irreconcilable with extending national independence to the Palestinians. It's being a bit. The British post-war economy creaked under the weight of a bitter winter and the huge reconstruction effort needed to provide homes after the Blitz. Moreover, the Labour government under Clement Attlee had determined that the British Empire was now an expensive liability, and much of it just had to go. Meanwhile, the Second World War had radicalized the Zionist movement, and they were no longer happy with letting Britain drag its feet. Militant Zionist groups perpetrated terrorist attacks to push the British along. In July 1946, the Zionist underground organization, Irgun, had blown up the British Mandate's central offices at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people. Zionist insurgents frequently targeted British soldiers for kidnapping and murder. Seeing no end in sight, on 1st of February 1947, Britain referred the future of Palestine to the UN. The UN was less than 2 years old at this point and had no experience in addressing decades-long conflicts like the situation in Palestine. Moreover, most of the colonized world was still not represented in the UN, as the main wave of decolonization was yet to come. On most issues, the UN would wind up as a diplomatic battlefield between the two superpowers, the US and the USSR. However, anyone hoping for a showdown between two power blocks on Palestine would be disappointed. Both states absented themselves from participating in the committee for investigating the situation. In May 1947, the UN appointed 2 delegates each from 11 neutral member states to find a solution to what it termed the Palestine question. This was the UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP. It arrived in Palestine in June and held many public hearings before it submitted a final report recommending partition in September 1947. The Palestinian political leadership, represented by the Arab Higher Committee, boycotted the committee's processes. It demanded that Palestine be treated the same as all its neighbouring Arab countries, which had obtained full independence once their respective mandates had ended. Palestinians refused to legitimize a process that considered their right to independence as up for negotiation. They compared their situation to that of Algeria and asked the UN whether the Algerians would agree to negotiate their right to their own country with French settlers in the future. By this point, some of the more perceptive Palestinian politicians and intellectuals had cottoned on to what the Zionist leadership actually wanted: as much of Palestine as they could get, with as few Palestinians as possible. They were frustrated that Zionism's own plans weren't discussed seriously as an obstacle to resolving the conflict in the halls of the UN. Ultimately, diplomatic efforts failed because no one could provide any justification for why Palestine was being handled as an exceptional case, a place where the much vaunted principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples in the UN Charter did not apply. The Arab world and Palestine. 1945 to 7. The Arab world supported Palestine's rejection of UNSCOP, vocalizing its solidarity through the position of the Arab League, a new organization founded in 1945. This would affect the course of Palestinian history considerably. Only one Arab state differed, Transjordan. This would affect the course of Palestinian history considerably. In order to understand why the Jordanians deviated from the consensus Arab position, we need to go back in time to the making of Jordan as a state. Transjordan was established as a British protectorate in 1921. Formerly, like Palestine, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. When Transjordan was occupied by the British in 1918, the initial plan was to incorporate it into mandatory Palestine. But then developments in Hejaz, the region containing Islam's holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, complicated the situation in Transjordan. During the First World War, a local dynasty, the Hashemites, declared the Hejaz as an independent kingdom under their rule. The British made an alliance with them. In return for the Hashemites fighting against the Ottomans, the British would recognize them as an independent state. Moreover, the British promised that the Hashemites would be able to establish new royal houses in what would become Syria and Iraq, to be headed by the heirs of Hussein bin Ali, who was the Sharif of Mecca and the king of Hejaz. But none of these promises were easy to keep. In the Arabian Peninsula, the British had also supported the arch rivals of the Hashemites, the House of Saud. So Britain did not intervene when the Saudis waged a war against the Hashemites, occupying Hejaz in 1924 and making it an integral part of Saudi Arabia. Originally, the British promised the Kingdom of Iraq to Sharif Hussein's elder son, Abdullah, and the Kingdom of Syria to his younger son, Faisal. But Britain had also agreed that Syria would be under France's control in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, so it was no longer theirs to give away. Making contradictory promises to different parties is something of a theme in Britain's foreign relations. The two sons decided to take action themselves and change the map of the region. Faisal, with the help of the legendary Lawrence of Arabia, the British progenitor of the alliance between the British and the Hashemites, exploited the fact that until 1920 there were no French troops on the ground in the eastern Mediterranean. He entered Damascus in 1918 as the new ruler, not only of the city, but of what he called the Greater Syria, including Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Israel, and the Palestinian territories of today. He lasted a little under 2 years with no official international recognition. He was forced to surrender to the French in 1920. The British sought to appease him by installing him as king in Iraq in 1921, leaving no throne for his elder brother Abdullah. In 1920, Abdullah had marched out of Hejaz with 20,000 men behind him, supposedly to liberate Syria from the French. His troops were stationed in Amman, Transjordan. While Abdullah was waiting there, threatening to occupy Syria, the British reshuffled the parts of the Arab world that were under their control at a conference in Cairo in May 1921. The conference was led by the then British Secretary of State for the Colonies, Winston Churchill. He proposed that Abdullah would be given Transjordan as his new kingdom. Transjordan became Jordan and was now its own state, separate from Mandatory Palestine. It's not working real well here. It's getting the occasional little bit of a blackout. The right wing of the Zionist movement, led by Zev Jabotinsky, did not accept this loss of territory, seeing Transjordan as part of the future Jewish state. Even today, the lands in Jordan are shown as part of Israel on the flag of Beitar, a right-wing Zionist youth movement descended from Jabotinsky's organization. However, the Labour Zionists, who at the time dominated the Zionist movement as a whole, welcomed Hashemite control over Transjordan. From the beginning, Abdullah was in close contact with the Jewish Agency, effectively the Zionist administration for the Jewish community during the mandatory period. He wanted to expand his kingdom, composed of relatively arid land, with an eye to the fertile territory in mandatory Palestine. As well as the Jewish Agency, he developed a working relationship with the pragmatic Nashashibi family in the Palestinian leadership, a more moderate faction than the Husseinis. Let's return to 1947. By the time UNSCOP was formed and began its deliberations, the relationship between the Jewish Agency and Abdullah had reached a more practical stage. It seems that both sides agreed that Transjordan could expand into parts of Mandatory Palestine in return for its tacit consent for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. This is why Abdullah was the only Arab leader willing to meet with UNSCOP. The other members of the Arab League had no inkling of these secret arrangements. The Arab League continued to try and pressure the UN into adopting an approach to Palestine based on the principles of democracy and self-determination. After the UN came out in favor of partition, the Arab League began building a volunteer army, the Arab Liberation Army, and was prepared to contemplate a military operation in Mandatory Palestine should diplomatic efforts all fail. Zionist strategies, 1945-7. Unlike the Palestinians, who focused their efforts on securing international legitimacy, the Zionist movement saw the end of the mandate as an opportunity to swiftly establish their dominance on the ground. The Zionist movement had been demanding that the mandate end since 1942. For them, the British couldn't leave a day too soon. Throughout 1945-7, they laid the groundwork to take over the entire country's administration. The Palestinian leadership believed, with no small amount of naivety, that as they were both the native population and the majority, the UN would obviously make Palestine a state for the Palestinians. The Zionist leaders believed that actions speak louder than words. They correctly calculated that the international community would not help the Palestinians reclaim what the Zionists had taken by force to begin with. So they planned to conquer all strategic posts as soon as British troops vacated them. Radio, postal services, telecommunications, railways, airspace, public transport, banking, and, of course, land. Over 2 years, they intensified the buildup of military forces, obtaining arms from abroad and devising a system of conscription for all young Jewish men and women in Palestine. The British considered the Haganah, which transformed from a paramilitary organization into essentially the regular army of a state that did not yet exist, to be the second most powerful military force in the Middle East. Even survivors of the Holocaust in Europe, many of them still stuck in displaced persons camps, were recruited into Zionist military organizations. The process of joining a Zionist army was much smoother than getting a visa to the US. Towards the end of 1947, all eyes were on New York. The UN was, at long last, about to make a final decision about the future of Palestine. On 29th of November, the UN General Assembly voted for Resolution 181, now infamous in international law. It declared itself in favor of the partition of Palestine. Zionists celebrated, as Israel still does today. They had finally got the Jewish state they had been promised. For Palestinians, it's the day the Nakba began. The day that fired a warning shot for a catastrophe that they still endure in our times. Chapter 7. The Partition Resolution and its Aftermath. Before we turn to the impact of the Partition Resolution on the ground, we need to examine the perplexing geopolitical maneuvering at the UN more closely. UNSCOP, the special committee made up of 11 member states, could not actually arrive at a consensus position in what was to be done in Palestine. it introduced two proposals, one by the minority, one by the majority. The minority plan recommended a bi-national federal state in Palestine, divided into Arab and Jewish nations, with Jewish immigration permitted in the Jewish nation. The federal government would be elected by all adult citizens across the Arab and Jewish states. In UNSCOP, this was only supported by India, Iran, and Yugoslavia. The majority supported the partition of Palestine into two states. The majority proposal offered 56% of Palestine for a Jewish state, which included most of the important UN concessions, such as electricity, ports, and phosphates within that territory, and 43% for a Palestinian state. Jerusalem and its surroundings would be governed by a corpus separatum, i.e., an international enclave. The Jewish state would be made up of almost equal numbers of Jews and Palestinians, and the Arab state would have a vast majority of Palestinians. Both communities could decide where to vote and where to belong to as citizens. The two states were supposed to have a common currency and economy and a jointly agreed immigration policy. On the 29th of November 1947, the UN General Assembly voted only on the majority proposal, slightly amended after discussion by an ad hoc committee of all member states. Ultimately, 33 states voted in favour of partition, with 13 votes against and 10 abstentions. By the skin of their teeth, the Zionist movement had scraped a majority of 2/3. It almost didn't happen. Although the UN, then composed of 57 nations, were still dominated by European imperial powers, the US and the USSR, there were member states that remembered only too well the brutality of colonization, such as Liberia and Haiti. The vote was initially due to take place on the 26th of November, but the Zionist movement worried they wouldn't be able to secure the votes they needed. So, through some diplomatic wrangling, it was postponed until the 29th of November. The Zionist lobby in the US urged the US government to pressure recalcitrant states into voting for partition, a key milestone as it entailed international recognition of a Jewish state. The US government, which was already pro-Zionist by default at this point, was only too happy to comply and promised hesitant states funding for developing their countries, or threatening to withdraw such funding. This is the classic carrot and stick approach wealthier nations deploy in diplomacy. Resolution 181 also proposed a timeline for the next year. It set the date for the termination of the British Mandate as 14th of May 1948. Until then, Britain would still be responsible for law and order, assisted by a new UN Palestine Committee in implementing the partition plan. Both the US and USSR, despite being rival powers, came together to support the partition plan. The USSR upturned decades of staunch anti-Zionism as part and parcel of communism, and came out in favour of the possibility of partition as early as May 1947. Even though Arab states were convinced the USSR would side with them, Stalin saw Zionism as a way of weakening Britain's influence in the region, and facilitated mass emigration of Jews from the USSR and Poland into the displaced persons camps, the ultimate destination being Palestine. In the US, an assertive Zionist lobbying effort strong-armed the American president into supporting partition and convincing others to support it. This was despite the skepticism of the US State Department and its experts on the Middle East, who thought such an embrace of Zionism harmed other US interests in the region. Meanwhile, the British government was hardly wild about the prospect of a Palestinian Arab state, which it disparagingly dubbed the Mufti state. Since the Great Arab Revolt in 1936, Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini had been the arch enemy of Britain in the Arab world. Even though he and many other Palestinian leaders who fled after the revolt were not permitted to return to Palestine, he still seemed to be leading the Palestinian national movement from his exile in Cairo. The British believed he would become the leader of the future Palestinian state and act against their interests in the region. In order to avert this prospect, Britain opted to strengthen the position of King Abdullah of Transjordan by proposing to him that he annex some of the Palestinian territory in the UN partition plan to his own kingdom. They happily encouraged King Abdullah to deepen his ties to the Zionist leadership in Palestine. It was with Britain's knowledge and tacit consent that King Abdullah came to an informal agreement with the Zionist leadership. If some of the Palestinian Arab territories were annexed to Transjordan, he would do his best to stand back from the Arab League's opposition to partition. This was music to the Zionists' ears. In 1947, it was evident that an attempt to take over Palestine by force could prompt a formidable military reaction from the Arab world. The Zionist leadership needed a way to undermine the Arab military effort from the outset. The Arab Legion, Jordan's state army, was the most efficient army in the Arab world. It was the only army that had fought in the Second World, in the Anglo-Iraqi. All its senior officials were British, right up to the Chief of the General Staff, Sir John Bagot Glubb. Neutralizing this army, or even limiting its participation, would make it much easier for Zionists to transform Palestine into a Jewish state. The complacency of the international community, the curious alliance that came together for the Zionist cause at the UN, and the way that a Jewish state was effectively treated as a fait accompli help explain the reactions that followed on the ground. Jewish settlers received the news with joy, even if the proposed partition was nowhere near what they wanted in theory. The fundamental point was that the highest international body had recommended creating a Jewish state. Meanwhile, Palestinians heard the message loud and clear. Self-determination didn't apply to them. Palestinians took to the streets to protest against the resolution, with the demonstrations turning violent in some cases. Yet after a few days, an uneasy calm prevailed. For both Palestinians and Zionists, it was time to prepare for a cataclysm. Knowing that Zionists were arming themselves, Palestinian politicians still on the ground felt that their existence was under threat. The Zionist paramilitary organization Irgun, as well as targeting the British, attacked Arab villages to induce fear and encourage Palestinian Arabs to leave. Palestinians tried to organize paramilitary groups to defend their communities, but the few weapons they had were of poor quality, and even fewer had experience in wielding them. Anyone with a real gift for military organization had already been killed or imprisoned during the 1936 revolt. the Palestinian leadership hoped the Arab League's volunteer force might offer more protection, but their hopes would be dashed. At the end of the day, Palestinian youth formed two small paramilitary organizations, aided by a few hundred volunteers who managed to enter Palestine. Most of them were organized under a new body established by the Arab League, the Arab Liberation Army, led by Fawzi al-Khawukji, an Iraqi officer with experience in the Arab Revolt. But the Arab League decided not to send any regular troops before the end of the British Mandate, scheduled for 14th of May 1948. The array of forces on the Palestinian side was no match for the three Zionist paramilitary groups, the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Stern Gang. These groups were better equipped, had served in the British Army, and, crucially, had at least 10 times as many members. The international community all signed up to a charter committed to the rule of law, justice, and equal rights for nations, had cleared the road for a catastrophe. A catastrophe so all-encompassing, it became the very definition of the Arabic word, Nakba. And that will be it for tonight. Just figured I would make this a short one for the time being. So I will leave it here. Now, I am considering expanding the live streams possibly to make them longer, to do more in them, to maybe do more streams than 3 per week, just to try and build things up and to diversify into things other than reading and gaming, like news, commentary, reactions, that kind of stuff, primarily political, apart from the gaming. But yeah, that is my thoughts for consideration at the moment. So, yeah, that is where I currently am sitting on that. And yeah, that will pretty much be it for tonight. If you're liking the streams, feel free to subscribe to the channel if you're on YouTube and click that bell to get notified for future streams. Or if you're on Twitter, feel free to just follow me there. So yeah, that's it for now. Next Tuesday, I will begin reading Clinton Fernandez's Sub-Imperial Power, Australia in the International Arena. And on Thursday, next Thursday, I'll continue playing Freedom Planet 2. And yeah, with that all out of the way, I'll see you guys next time.